Hi, good morning friends. We've been studying the theories of economic development and growth given by classical economists. In the first two lectures, we've covered Adam Smith's and T.R. Malthus's theories. Today, we're going to study the theory given by David Ricardo, who was another key classical English economist of the 19th century. His theory is both a continuation and an amalgamation of the previous two theories, the ones given by Smith and Malthus. A lot of interesting aspects have to be covered. So we'll do this in two parts, two lectures, to ensure that we don't lose out on any detail and also that the video length remains reasonable. Let's begin with the first part. In his famous work titled Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which was published in 1817, he gave his views on various aspects of economics, such as on distribution of income, determination of rent, also called the theory of rent, etc. He concurred with Adam Smith's views on the important role of capital accumulation in an economy, and also that in the long run the economy ends in a stationary state. Besides, he expanded on Malthusian thoughts on scarcity of land, that is, land is a fixed resource and there are diminishing returns in agriculture. He considered these factors as hindrances in economic expansion. Like Malthus, his views on the long-term state of economy were also pessimistic, but more structured than Malthus's views. When we say pessimistic, we mean that in the long term, we expect, or anticipate is a better word, the economy going down. Both Malthus and Ricardo had a gloomy outlook on the long-term growth of economy. They foresaw population bursting at its seams, profits and as a result capital accumulation inevitably going down, and a stationary state somewhere down the line. However, just digressing a bit, it is not wrong to have pessimistic views on something. Both pessimistic and optimistic views exist side by side in all spheres of life. For example, in the stock market, there are those who are highly optimistic about the state of economy and the market going up. They are those who foresee a strong bull run and are running full throttle on a stock buying spree. Then there are those who think that things aren't so good after all and that the markets may tank sooner than later. They predict bear run in the market and consider selling their holdings before things dry up. Both thoughts coexist, and that is why we always have buyers and sellers in the market. Anyways, coming back, let's start with the crux of Ricardo's theory. Ricardo primarily centers his theory on the distribution of national income among three key elements. Call it the three classes or the three groups. These are landlords, capitalists, and workers. He says that the entire income generated in the economy is shared or distributed among these three groups, where landlords earn rent, capitalists earn profits, and workers earn wages. Growth of the economy, he says, depends on how income is distributed among these three key classes or groups. He believes that capitalists are the most important group in the economy. They not only kickstart the engine of growth but also keep the ball of economic development rolling by continuously deploying their capital in profitable opportunities, though mainly agriculture, but also in manufacturing. They take all economic decisions, such as renting of land from landlords, hiring laborers and providing them with requisite tools, taking risks by exploring newer opportunities. They replow profits, accumulate capital, and invest further. According to Ricardo, capitalists are very frugal or thrifty, if you may, with spending. Their propensity to consume is very low. Therefore, whatever they earn as profits, they channelize that into productive investments called capital accumulation. Workers, on the other hand, are the largest of the three groups. They themselves do not own any means of production, no land or capital, therefore depend entirely on the capitalists for employment. They get only subsistence level wages for their work. These wages remain fixed, at least in real terms, and are just enough for their day-to-day survival. they are unable to make any savings. It comes out from his theory that Ricardo believed that above this, the subsistence wage rate, the population of workers multiplies rapidly. And below this rate, that is, if the wages fall below the subsistence rate, then the population decreases fast. Well, this notion to keep the wage rate constant at subsistence level so as to prevent long-term improvement in living standards of workers is known as the iron law of wages. We also discussed it briefly in Malthusian theory. It is natural that if living standards do not improve, if there are no long-term savings from income, and whatever income is there from wages, it is just enough for day-to-day survival. Workers would hesitate to start or grow their families then, and hence population will not swell or grow. You can revisit the previous lecture on Malthusian theory where we dealt with this classical thought in greater detail. Now, before we delve any deeper, let's list the key assumptions he made for his theory. Some of these I've already outlined so far. Let's revise all of them here. So, number one, as discussed, he assumes a three-class model of landlords, capitalists, and workers, where landlords earn rent, capitalists they earn profits, and workers earn wages. Next, he assumes that the supply of land is fixed, and therefore the law of diminishing returns operates on land. That is, as more and more labor and capital are applied to land, marginal productivity declines. All workers are paid subsistence wages. Wage rate is determined by non-economic factors like the minimum subsistence needs of labor. If economy is expanding and food prices are on the rise, here by food prices we primarily mean corn because that is the commodity he talks about in his theory. So if food prices are on the rise, wage rate is increased in money terms. In real terms, it remains more or less constant. That is, inflationary adjustments are made to wages so as to allow workers to sustain themselves at subsistence level. Next, he says that agriculture is the most important sector of economy and corn is the only commodity grown. All payments, rents, wages, etc. are made in corn. Revenue and profits are in corn. Capital accumulation also happens in corn. There is perfect competition in the economy. Capital accumulation results from profits. This we know from our previous theories also. All capital is homogeneous and the only form of capital is circulating capital. By homogeneous he means that all capital is in the form of one currency which is corn and the only form of capital is circulating capital. For the purpose of articulating his theory, Ricardo considers corn as the only produce in the economy. Let me reiterate. All income is generated in corn, wages and rents are paid in corn, and capital accumulation also happens in corn. We'll study more about this in a few minutes when we'll see his single commodity model. Next, he assumes that the state of technology is given. It means technology is considered static and has no role in improving agricultural productivity. The supply price of labor is given and constant, which is the subsistence wage rate. The demand for labor depends on the accumulation of capital. More accumulation of capital leads to more investment, leads to higher employment, which further leads to higher demand for labor and vice versa. There is no factor substitution, that is, fixed factor coefficients of production are assumed. If 10 laborers are employed to operate 5 harvest machines, you cannot substitute 2 laborers out of those with 2 machines. Now, as we have discussed, Ricardo's theory is premised on the distribution of national income among 3 classes: landlords, capitalists, and workers. By now, you would have memorized it fully. Landlords, capitalists, and workers, the 3 classes that Ricardo assumes in his theory, among which the national income is distributed. Here, landlords earn rent, capitalists earn profits, and workers earn wages. He believes that growth in national income and hence growth in economy can be understood by studying the relative income shares of these 3 classes. That is, how do these 3 groups share income among themselves? Using that information, we will be able to understand how the growth in the economy is happening. This is what Ricardo believes. Now, let Y be the national income, W be the wages, and P as the residual profit. Then we can say that Y, which is the total income or the total output, is equal to rents plus wages plus profits, R plus W plus P. That is, total national income can be taken as the sum of R rents paid to landlords for using their fertile lands for cultivation, W wages paid to workers, and whatever remains, which is P, are the residual profits of capitalists. He calls it residual profit because this is what remains after paying wages and rents. Remember, here agriculture is assumed to be the most important activity in the economy, and all income is being generated through agriculture, which is cultivation of corn. Now, Ricardo argues that in a capitalist economy such as this, the division of national income is based on two principles, what he calls as marginal principle and surplus principle. Marginal principle explains the share of rent in the income. He suggests that rent is determined at the margin. Let's understand this first before moving ahead. He says that fertility of all land is not equal and land is ranked by fertility. The most fertile land produces greater output per unit of labor and capital, and the least fertile and the lesser fertile land produces lesser output per unit of labor and capital. The most fertile land is used up for cultivation first. Since land is a fixed resource, the most fertile land is used up for cultivation first. Since land is a fixed resource and we have already used up the most fertile part of it for cultivation, now if the population increases so much that we need to expand cultivation, we shall be gradually ending up cultivating on the least fertile land, which is what he calls the marginal land. He calls the least fertile land as the marginal land. The least fertile land, according to him, is the marginal land. And according to him, rent is determined by the productivity of the least fertile or the marginal land. Further, he says that this land just covers the production costs and it does not generate any rent. Why? Because the cost of production on this land is so high due to its very low to nil fertility that there is no expectation of rent from this piece of land. For example, if 10 laborers are required to grow 100 units of corn on the most fertile land, this land, the least fertile one, which he is calling the marginal land, requires greater factors of production, maybe 10 laborers, to grow lesser quantity, 50 units of corn. That is 2 times the cost of production. And this is what he calls the diminishing returns in agriculture. While overall productivity is increasing, earlier we were producing 100 units of corn only, now we are producing 150 units. But productivity on marginal land is declining compared to factors of production employed. Earlier we were producing 100 units with 10 laborers, now we are producing 50 units with 10 laborers. So the productivity on marginal land is declining. How is rent determined? Here he talks about the second principle, which he calls the surplus principle. Rent, he says, which is earned by the landlords, is the surplus production of the fertile land over the marginal land. That is the difference in output between superior and marginal lands. Sounds confusing, is it? Don't worry, we'll use an example to understand. Before we begin with the example, do recall that all payments in the economy are made in, yes, corn, which is the produce of cultivation in the economy. Now we know that marginal land, that is the least fertile land, does not generate any rent. We just understood that. Assume there are 3 tracts of land, 3 grades of land, if you may. Land A is the most fertile, land B is a little less fertile, and land C is the least fertile, which is the marginal land according to his definition. Each unit of land requires 1L plus 1K to cultivate, which is the combined unit of factors of production that we are using. 1L plus 1K to cultivate. Here 1L plus 1K is taken as a fixed bundle of input. That is, 1 unit is equal to 1L plus 1K. Let's assume this is 50 units of corn or 50 bushels of corn. Now, capital is, as we know, taken in the form of corn as well. It is used to pay labor, their wages as well. Output is measured in corn as well, bushels of corn. Now, let's see this example with some numbers. So, in this table, I draw the land grades in one of the columns, in this column. This is the output per unit. Per unit means per unit of the bundled factors of production that we have taken, which is 1L plus 1K. Again measured in corn, the output is measured in corn. Input is 1L plus 1K, we have already defined, and it is equal to 50. And the last column is surplus. So land A is the most fertile land, land B is a little less fertile than A, and land C is the least fertile land. Let's say the output coming out of land A is 120 units of corn. From land B is 80 units of corn, and from land C is 50 units of corn. Now the input we have already said is 50, which is fixed, a fixed bundle. Now, according to his definition, the rent is the surplus production of the fertile land over the marginal land. So land A is producing 120 units, the marginal land is producing 50 units, so the surplus is 70 units, which is the rent here. Land B is producing 80 units. When we subtract the number of units being produced by land C, it comes out to be 30, which is the rent of land B. Land C producing 50 units, the input is also 50 units, the surplus is 0, so the rent expectation from land C, which is the rent expectation from the marginal land, is 0. Now each land gets the same fixed bundle of input, which is 1L plus 1K is equal to 50 bushels of corn. Land C is marginal land, so just recovers the input cost, there is no rent. A and B are intra-marginal. They produce a surplus over cost, which becomes rent. Now, coming back to the definition of national income or total output, whatever we may like to call, since rent is a deduction from the total output or total income, Ricardo sees it as a parasitic influence on profits. Since profits are residual after deducting rents and wages, therefore higher the rent, lower will be the profits. And rent increases, as we have said, due to diminishing marginal returns on agriculture, that is due to the difference in productivity or fertility of land. Ultimately, profits will be squeezed out to the extent that capital accumulation will stop and economy will head towards a stationary state in the long run. Now, Ricardo has studied the distribution of income among these three classes through two models. We can discuss the single commodity model in this video, and the two commodity model we will take up in the next part, in the next lecture. Now, here again he makes some assumptions which are in addition to the assumptions that he originally made. Agriculture, this is the same assumption. Agriculture is the most important sector in the economy, and corn is the only commodity in the economy. Then he says a single period is taken as the agriculture year, that is from sowing till harvest. Like we take a financial year to calculate the profit and loss of the economy and to generate the balance sheet. In a similar way, in his assumption, the agriculture year, which is from the sowing of the corn crop till the harvest of the crop, he takes it as one financial year. Capital stock consists of last year's harvest only. So whatever capital stock is carried forward, it is of last year's harvest, nothing before that. Next, he says that agriculture sector is the only productive sector which transforms corn into more corn by natural reproduction and employing labor. Next, he says that labor gets subsistence wages in kind, that is payment in fixed quantity of corn only. So the labor is getting subsistence wages, but that payment is also made in corn because corn is the currency of this model. Wages fund is given and fixed for the agriculture year. Kind of a budgetary allocation is made for paying wages to labor throughout the year. Since wages are paid in corn, so a fixed quantity of corn, say 100 bushels, is set aside. Only as many laborers can be used as can be employed within this fixed budget, paying each one subsistence level wage. So he has assumed a kind of a budget which he calls the wage fund, and the labor is paid through this budgetary allocation. Next, he assumes that labor and capital are inseparable. That is, a unit of input is equal to a man year of work done together with fixed amount of capital. Recall the example that we just did of the three grades of land A, B and C, and how the fixed input bundle, which was 1L plus 1K, which was the fixed input, made it easy to track output differentials across land grades, leading to rent differentials. So he makes this assumption so that it makes it easy to track output differentials across the various land grades that we are taking, the most fertile to the least fertile, and the rent differentials that we are getting. Now in this model we track output of corn on the x-axis. So let's draw a diagram here. So we are tracking output of corn on the x-axis and capital to output ratio on the y-axis. Here the capital to output ratio basically implies the combined effect of income components, which are profits, wages and rents. So P, W and R. Now in the early phase, call it the growth phase, as output increases, profits also increase, showing expanding returns for capitalists and a stable or constant profit to capital ratio. Wages also increase modestly in money terms to show improving standards of living. Rent, if you see, remains low and flat since marginal land is still productive and cultivation has still not reached the least fertile zones. So if we just recap what happens in the growth phase, capital accumulation thrives in this phase, living standards improve slightly, rent is negligible, and profit to capital ratio stays healthy. Now, when output increases with diminishing rate, which is what leads to the stationary state, which is the road to the stationary state. Now, wages, they remain constant at fixed subsistence levels. Now, rents start increasing with output due to diminishing returns and expansion of cultivation to marginal lands. And if rents start increasing, then what will reduce, because overall the income comprises of rents, wages and profits. Of course, the rents will eat into the profits. So the profits begin to shrink as the rents rise. So as seen through this model, the Ricardian model, what comes out is that profit is the only motivating force that keeps the economy in motion. As it shrinks over a period of time, the economy comes to a halt, which is the stationary state. Now, in the next lecture, we'll take up Ricardo's two commodity model, and we will also talk about the overall criticisms of Ricardian model. So, we'll end this part here. Thank you very much.